few years ago, I encountered this truly remarkable essay. It's called Against All Odds, and I recommend it to anyone to read. It's such an incredible statement about human history and human potential. And the author of this essay, Adam Hochschild, is the co-founder of Mother Jones magazine. And he wrote this essay with the intent of, basically challenging this idea that the problems we face today are so entrenched and so difficult, nothing significant can really be achieved in our lifetimes, and certainly some small group of people can't really affect what happens. And he does this brilliantly by taking us on this journey through the English anti-slavery movement. Because I'm talking about two different movements together, I'm talking about the English anti-slavery movement in history and the contemporary animal advocacy movement, I want to make no mistake that the individuals, groups of individuals that experience oppression and exploitation all have their own experience, and it has to be respected and acknowledged. And nothing that I do is attempting to compare the experience of any members of any group who have experienced oppression. However, what I freely do is compare the mentality of those involved in exploitation and caught up in carrying out oppression, because in my own study of history, I find amazing parallels between the mentality of those caught up in these negative practices across history. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. The grassroots movement to end the practice of slavery in England, which happened before it did in the United States, was the first movement in human history where large numbers of people who were not themselves the focus of the oppression, okay, so these were individuals who were not enslaved themselves, joined a movement to free those who were. And it's just highly, highly significant. We've had something like this happen in our lifetime. The effort to prevent the Iraq War was the first global effort to prevent a war from happening in human history. But way back in the 1700s, there was a movement that enjoined large numbers of people who had never, ever been involved in agitating for the end of a practice that wasn't directly affecting them. Very, very significant turning point in our hopeful evolution as humans, that this could be possible. And I just want to give you a little feel for Mr. Hochschild's essay and just read you a little bit some excerpts from it to give you a sense of what he discovered when he studied this. From Sheffield, famous for making scissors, scythes, knives, razors, and the like, 769 metal workers petitioned the Parliament in 1789 because their wares were sold to slave ship captains for use as currency to buy slaves. The Sheffield cutlers wrote they might be expected to favor the slave trade. This was in their economic interest. This was a huge market for what they did. But they vigorously opposed it. Metal workers by the hundreds. And their representative said, your petitioners consider the case of the nations of Africa as their own. Okay, 1789, metal workers going to Parliament saying, not on my watch. Okay, their case is my case. I mean, this is remarkable. Stephen Fuller, the agent for the planters, for the slaveholders, and a key figure in the pro-slavery lobby, he wrote in bewilderment that petitions flooding into Parliament were stating no grievance or injury of any land or sort affecting the petitioners themselves. Why? Because it was an injury to their conscience. And this is a new phenomenon in human history. Mr. Hochschild goes on, though born in the age of swords, wigs, and stagecoaches, the British anti-slavery movement leaves us an extraordinary legacy. Every day, activists use tools it helped pioneer. Consumer boycotts, newsletters, petitions, political posters and buttons, national campaigns with local committees, and much more. So all of these things that are so familiar to us, they didn't always exist. They weren't always practiced by people trying to work for change. In this remarkable period of human history, there was a blossoming of understanding, and the brilliance of it had to do with an understanding that if we're going to change this, it's going to be because a lot of us are involved. And not only are a lot of us involved, a lot of us understand what it is. How do you do that? And they came up with all of these devices and methods that we continue to use. That's how good they were. But what Mr. Hochschild focused on was not as much the methods, but the boldness of a small group of people meeting and saying, you know what? Let's stop this. This is crazy. This is horrific that our society is carrying out this atrocity on millions of people, and let's stop it, and let's start the work today. We don't know how long it's going to take, but we're very clear about what our goal is. We're not going to hide it from anybody. We're not going to water it down. And we're not going to assume that the same things that convinced us that this needs to end aren't going to convince other people. We're just going to share our experience. You know, when you think of the problems that we face today, many people who might seem to be hard-headed realists would say, no way, can't change, we're talking generations here. The way that these kinds of oppressions and exploitations are woven into the economy, the products people wear, what they eat, even their entertainment. I mean, at every level, these kinds of oppression insert themselves and like tentacles wound around all aspects of society. And when you start to understand that, it feels like it could never change. It could never change. And you know, he helps us grasp in this era what it was like. In 1787, well over 3/4 of the people on the earth are in bondage of one kind or another. 3/4 of all humans. In parts of the Americas, slaves outnumber free people. African slaves are scattered widely through much of the Islamic world. In India and other parts of Asia, some people are outright slaves, others in debt bondage that ties them to a particular landlord as harshly as any slave to a southern plantation owner. In Russia, the majority of people are serfs. So in this time in human existence, vast numbers, the majority, are under the direct, total control of some small number of others. It's really incredible. And you know, he basically points out, if you had proposed at that time to say, you know what, you know, we can change this. You know, such a person would have been considered probably insane. And you know, as he points out, you know, the 9 out of 10 would think that, and the 10th person would say, well, maybe it can, but if it does, it's going to ruin everything. You know, and they will say it'll ruin the economy, it'll ruin the family, it'll ruin religion, it'll ruin our educational system, it will destroy our culture if we stop doing this. Every time there's a systematic oppression, that is the message that comes back when people say, let's change it. So here's the punchline of this particular part of his essay, is that all that's true. However, by the end of the 19th century, slavery was, at least on paper, outlawed almost everywhere. Okay? In a very short span of time, this huge institution, huge, that was tied to everything, was against the law. Okay? Essentially one lifetime. And what's amazing is this unstoppable wave of change was sparked by the efforts of a quite small number of visionary activists, some of whom were formerly enslaved individuals. There were educators, political leaders, and they were using these methods that are familiar to us today. And it's just so interesting that we take for granted now that, at least on paper, we know that human slavery exists on our planet now in some significant proportion, but at least on paper, it's against the law, and it's understood by most people to be morally reprehensible. And it started with a small group of individuals saying, we can do this, let's change it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tactics. The very familiar concept to all of us now of the boycott. People started saying, where does this sugar come from? It comes from enslavement and torture and oppression, and they called tea the blood-stained beverage, and hundreds of thousands of people stopped using sugar. But these documents are really very interesting to see. You know, it's an address to the people of Great Britain, proving the necessity of refraining from sugar and rum in order to abolish the African slave trade. And these pamphlets were distributed by the thousands, changing the understanding of vast numbers of people. And you know, as this was a new phenomenon in human history, the people who were enmeshed in slavery were horrified by this. And it was very upsetting to them because their world was getting disturbed and rocked. And so they began to do some things that we now are very familiar with as well. Other techniques were invented to counter the activism. And so the message is put out. Sugar is not a luxury, but a necessity of life. And great injury have many persons done to their constitutions by totally abstaining from it. I mean, does that sound familiar? And you know, this is really you know, where this essay really started to get my attention, is when he started to talk about how, you know, yes, these grassroots methods were pioneered, but also methods of co-option, distortion, and delay were also pioneered during this era. So the ball keeps bouncing, the battle continues to evolve. And you know, understanding that is just as important as understanding how the change was brought about. How was it resisted? It was resisted. the same way it's being resisted in our era to a large extent. So, as I can tell from the laughter in the room, we know that the meat industry, the egg industry, and the dairy industry put out the same message, that these foods are a necessity for a healthful life, and that refusing to eat them for reasons of conscience, self-destructive and unrealistic and ignorant. So he talks about the counterattacks. The pro-slavery forces bought a book for distribution, and he talks about how in a college town, Cambridge, which he said they were lefties even then, they printed 8,000 copies of the pamphlet about how each happy slave family had a snug little house and a garden, plenty of pigs and poultry. And they sponsored a London musical, The Benevolent Planters, in which two black lovers separated in Africa end up living in adjoining plantations in the West Indies and are reunited by their kindly owners. I mean, if you think about how ingenious this is, how diabolical, here's the playbill for The Benevolent Planters. So some real thought and effort and craft went into creating the counter message, ensconcing it in the realm of entertainment, wrapping it in the framework of a positive, redemptive story of these, tragic, star-crossed lovers brought together through the system of slavery to a happy ending. Sounds fantastical, but wait till you see where we're going with this. And again, the idea of language and the manipulation of language. So they recognized, that the word slave, connoted something negative. So let's call these people assistant planters, and everybody will think it's all okay. And again, in every issue, these things happen. It's the same dynamic over and over and over. And that's very useful information. So again, going back to this theme, that what they were doing, and this is what happens again every time, is you shift. If you want to maintain an oppressive system, you shift the discussion from the justice or the justification for the oppression itself. Why are we allowed to have absolute control over these others? You never want that question to be discussed or thought about. What you want to do is shift the question to, how shall we control and dispose of the fate of these others? What is the right way to do that? It conveys an aura of morality, of concern, of righteousness, because we're trying to do things the right way. But we're not really talking about what is the right thing to do. It is very, very effective.